Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast. This is episode 111, The Righteous Musician with Reena Esmail. True diversity is the varied life experiences and cultural upbringings that lead us to our widely disparate moral palettes. As we gather together in classrooms, ensembles, businesses, and organizations, we talk a good diversity game. But rarely do we attempt to measure these things in our diversity matrix. This episode is a Choralosophy Book Club discussion about a book that gives us the tools to do just that. Reena Esmail returns to the show to discuss the book The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion by psychologist Jonathan Haidt. If you are interested in how your mind brings you to your decisions about right and wrong, about good and evil, and much more, then this book and this conversation is for you. Now, this discussion is really important when we're thinking about what makes us truly separate from and different from and distinct from each other. Because, as I mentioned in the intro, it's not something you can measure in a photograph. These are the types of things that take curiosity, questions, getting to know each other, and this book is a fantastic way to learn how to do that in the most sound, research-based psychological way. You will also learn about the 6 key moral foundations that are discussed in the book, and whether you knew it or not, will be present in all of your classrooms, again, your businesses, your organizations. Those are all there. And if you don't know how to measure them, I'm going to argue that you don't know how to measure true diversity. Don't forget to use your Choralosophy checkout code to get yourself a discount at a variety of vendors. If you need sheet music, head over to graphitepublishing.com or ryanmain.com and use that promo code and get 10% off. When you are getting your Sight Reading Factory memberships for the upcoming school year, for you and your entire classroom, every single student, or any time you need to get a few more teacher memberships or student memberships, enter Choralosophy at checkout there as well and get 10% off. And of course, when you need a singer's mask and or music choir folders, a variety of other choir room materials, you can go to mymusicfolders.com, which is a great vendor, and you can enter Choralosophy at checkout there and get a discount. Go to choralosophy.com. Under the show tab, I now have categories of all types of conversations. The book club ones, COVID ones, diversity ones, all kinds of things, ways to categorize. So that way, if you've got a friend or a colleague who wants just to get introduced to the show with a certain type of episode, you can share that there. Okay, everybody. Serena Esmail is back on the Choralosophy podcast. Welcome back. Reena, it's good to see you again.
It's so great to be here again. I had such a great time with you last time we talked, so I'm excited to dive in.
Yeah, this is going to be good. So I want to tell a little bit of the story of why this episode is a thing before we dive in. So Reena was on episode 57. I was introduced to Reena through Oxford Press with the Oxford series on the show. And we had a great conversation. We realized during the conversation that we are kindred spirits in a lot of ways. And at some point in that conversation, you brought up being a fan of psychologist Jonathan Haidt and had read The Righteous Mind. I had read The Coddling of the American Mind. And so we then started brainstorming that maybe we should have a conversation about some of Jonathan Haidt's work. And so today, you are going to hear 2 musicians talk about psychology, talking about The Righteous Mind. So Reena, when you read this book, this is kind of, I want to dive in because folks who need to know more about Reena, you should go back and listen to episode 57. That way we can jump past all the introductions.
Right.
Reena's a composer. Okay, that's enough.
Perfect.
Yeah, that's right. And so Reena, when you were reading The Righteous Mind for the first time, what were the things that jumped out at you as saying, you mentioned right as we were getting ready, this is so relevant, right? What was it that grabbed you about this work?
Well, admittedly, the time when I was reading it was right at that time leading up to the 2020 election. And I know that everyone was stressed out about it, for some people for a variety of different reasons. But I think, I was particularly stressed out because I knew that, maybe I live in California, I live in this very liberal bubble, and I knew that I wasn't really getting the full picture of why people would see any different way, because everyone around me, saw things very similarly to one another. But I was like, I know there's this whole other part of the country and there's so many different ways of thinking about things. How can I really begin to understand that? And it was stressing me out that I couldn't see that. And so when one of my friends, Maya Jasper, recommended And why don't you read The Righteous Mind? It'll give you kind of a better sense of what the whole picture is and the whole spectrum is, rather than just what you seem to be thinking about the political divide. And the minute I read it, I know I read it in those weeks leading up to the election, and I just felt this calm that I hadn't felt before, that whatever happened one way or another, I understood at least the framework behind different people's thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think what I took out of it, I just read it recently. Like I'd said, when we talked before, I had read a different book by the same author and psychologist, and I came back and read this one pretty recently just to get ready to talk to you about it. And one of the things that I picked up on really quickly is just the overarching theme of the book for me, which was really powerful, which was that we think we have this idea that we think that what we're doing when we make a judgment about the world is that we look at it coldly and rationally, and we just look at the facts and read the science and whatever it is, and then we make up our mind based on what those inputs are. And in reality, the psychological research shows, and he does a really good narrative job throughout the book of kind of lining out study after study and telling the story of how these studies were done, that really shows that that's not what we're doing when we make our decisions. What we're doing is we're reacting emotionally, and then afterwards, we come back, because that emotional reaction happens so quickly we don't know it's happening. And then afterwards, we start to immediately rationalize with our logical mind to explain the emotional reaction we just had. And that just, first of all, really pissed me off, because I've always prided myself on how cold and rational that I can be if I really want to be. And I'm sure everyone's on a spectrum of that anyway, but just to learn that that's not really how our brain works. Did that tickle you in the same way?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, Jonathan Haidt goes into all these things of like, okay, if you were to dip a cockroach into a cup of tea, and you just knew that cockroach was completely sterilized and everything was fine, and you just drank the tea knowing that a cockroach had been dipped into there with no health restrictions, no issues, and I was like, yeah, I still wouldn't drink it. And I literally cannot explain why. And it's so fascinating as to like, it's funny because I also really pride myself on being a logical person. I'm a math nerd. I love spreadsheets. I'm like, really someone who, if I hadn't become a musician, I would have gone into probably a mathematical field. And it's just so fascinating that like, I could see that even I just really couldn't justify or find ways to get around these weird hangups that come from, our rational minds not making those decisions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I feel like too that I really liked the way he used a metaphor kind of throughout the book too of the elephant and a rider, which was a really good way of explaining it. And I think that's good right off the bat at the beginning of this conversation to explain that to the audience, who of course everybody should just go read the book. But he used the metaphor of the elephant and the rider, and the elephant represents our emotional kind of animal brain that just kind of reacts in disgust or in anger or lust or whatever it is, with these kind of visceral reactions. And then the rider can steer the elephant, but the rider is much smaller, and the rider is not as powerful as the elephant. But they work together, and the rider serves the elephant, and it's kind of an interesting way of thinking about it, because it's also kind of like our rational brain becomes like our lawyer, almost justifying and explaining after the fact to the judge why we made the stupid decision that we made, or maybe the good decision or whatever. It's interesting.
I mean, it's also that one of the things that he said about the writer is that the writer kind of serves as the PR department for the person, like you're saying, kind of the lawyer, the person who has to explain to others, it's again, why do we have to rationalize things? It's often not to ourselves, it's to other people, and it's funny because, for most of my life, I lived alone. And then, in the last, 3 or so years, I've been married, living with my husband, and he'll sometimes say things to me like, what are you doing like this? And it's like, you don't even realize when you're just doing things by yourself that you have these odd habits. And the minute you have to explain it to someone else, then you have to go back and think, well, why did I do this? Well, why is this, what makes me do this thing? And you have to come up with some explanation that often is not the point. It's often just kind of beside the point, but you have to make yourself seem like there's some reason why it fits into society. And, there are good reasons, we should be doing things that allow us to live together and have the harmony that we need. But I think it just goes so far beyond that of like what our perception of people's sense of social capital is and how we fit into that social capital. And as we can see, because social media has taken so much advantage of that, we just have these really deep senses of what that PR department on top of the elephant is.
Yeah. Yeah, I like the PR department analogy of it too, because again, by the way, I'll say this: anyone listening, if you think like I did, that you hear us talking about this so far, and you're like, well, no, I'm someone who looks at the facts first, and I make my decisions based on what I see, and no, you don't. No, you don't.
Right.
I think that's the point of the book is the showing empirically through study after study after study that is not, it's just not how the brain works. And I think that's one of the most powerful aspects of the book for me, is showing that it's not a question of whether or not we can choose to do that or not. It's just that that's not how it works. Now, one of the things that he did say is that that doesn't mean that our writer or our PR department or our rational mind has no role to play. Because it is possible, he goes into detail to explain how it is possible that the writer can override the elephant and steer it in a different direction, but it's rare, and it takes intentionality, which is kind of the reason I wanted to have this conversation and get people to read the book, is because it takes knowing that your elephant is in charge to be able to ever have a chance to win that battle.
Exactly. And it takes kind of also, in your own mind, having a curiosity about the other side of things. And I
Hmm.
think about this, I mean, so because, I work with a lot of groups in different parts of the country. And I remember I used to be so scared to go to places where I felt that I might be politically challenged, or maybe people were on a different side of a divide, or, that I wouldn't be able to have a conversation, or I wouldn't be able to get into something with someone. And the thing that I love about this book is it really gave me the tools to be able to walk in. Maybe there's a donor who, thinks things that are very different from my political views. Maybe they even say, for example, they believe that like immigrants shouldn't be in this country or something. I mean, I'm a child of immigrants. I'm there. What do I do? And I think I used to take it so personally. I used to think that I had compiled the facts in a certain way in my mind, so I was in the know, and it was my job to like educate them about it. But then I suddenly realized, what I should actually be doing is trying to figure out what they're thinking. What are the facts that they're
Hmm.
putting together, and kind of if I just remove myself from the equation and I actually see things the way that they're seeing them, and through their, we'll get into these various moral matrices in terms of like what are important to other people. You can literally learn so much and have discussions with anyone you meet. And that was what was really empowering to me about the book.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually am glad you brought that up. This just a little scenario about you potentially interacting with a donor. And so I want to develop that a little bit more to think about. I've got my own ideas, but I want to hear yours first, of why largely an audience of musicians that typically listens to this show, why should they care? In other words, why is this relevant information for musicians to know about this stuff? This is not even music. We're not even talking about music right now. Why should we care?
Well, I mean, so many reasons, but one I think is that we just thinking about creativity, right? Like what is really creativity versus what is what we're told to do to want to like be successful, right? And as for me, as a professional musician, okay, there are certain people you have to write like to for people to take you seriously and for you to impress these people and then them to get you a job. And there's so few jobs in music. And so you get into the scarcity mentality that actually takes you out of the creative practice. And the creative practice is always this generative practice of asking questions and of asking yourself, okay, I'm going down this road. I have to make a choice creatively. But like, is the opposite of that maybe also true? Like, if I'm going, to this key, is it maybe also fine to go to that other key? Like, and I think sometimes we have to convince ourselves that something is more right, especially when we need reassurance or when we're scared. And it's fine to admit that you need those things, but also to see it for what it is. And so I think like there's certainly that. Just I think it allows you to be more open and creative when you're able to take in more inputs. And I mean, then there are so many other things, just your ability to oh, I lost my train of thought. It'll come back to me. But maybe yeah, you tell me some of the things that
Well,
you think are
yeah,
relevant to
yeah,
a
no, that's
musician.
good. So my thought is even outside of the actual act of doing music, the reason this type of material is really important for musicians to think about and to really reflect upon, is that we typically are not in situations where we would be challenged in this way around other musicians, because musicians oftentimes think the same. And I don't mean that we are the same, but we have a lot of those similar profiles in terms of creativity and how much we weigh emotion into our decisions, how politically aligned we are. I mean, I can't think of any outspoken, for example, outspoken conservative classical musician organization leader.
Right. Exactly.
I can't think of a single one. There were some when I was like 19.
Right.
Like that would have been a thing, but it's not a thing anymore. And so my point being that we aren't challenged as musicians unless we decide to go outside of our bubble and have these types of conversations, like you mentioned, in a situation where you might be maybe in the Midwest working with a music organization, and all of a sudden maybe half the room maybe that's a purple room instead of a blue room,
Right.
that kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think, one of these things that's so important, it's been so important in a lot of my life, is this idea of kind of code switching between different things. And,
Mm-hmm.
I do it a lot in my own music between Indian classical and Western classical music. And what I think actually is so funny about the book is that Jonathan Haidt actually was a Fulbrighter in India and also went to Yale. And so we share that trajectory. And I realized, one of the very early studies in the book is how he's talking about how across cultures, and he did this research study that was partly taking place in Orissa in India, and then partly taking place in somewhere in the Northeast or in Chicago or something. And he gave people a variety of statements and said, evaluate whether you think this is right or wrong. And what was really interesting is that if you're reading it, I mean, most people who are reading this book are going to be reading it in America, and they'll clearly see and feel viscerally that the statements that Americans think are morally acceptable, like they'll feel that, and they'll feel that the Indian statements are a little bit like, oh, that feels weird. Like, why would they think that that was morally acceptable? That feels like abuse. That feels like, this patriarchy, whatever. But for me, because I've had both experiences, I felt my brain doing this thing where I was like, oh, I can completely see how this is right. Oh, I can completely see how this is wrong. And you go back and forth between different kind of feelings in your brain when you embody different cultural spaces. And I think that's so incredible as a musician, and especially as, I'm a musician who wants to like connect different cultural spaces together. You have to understand the intuitive and visceral feelings of people in different places in order to be able to say, hey, I know that this feels fine for this group of people, and I know that it's like really weird for you. And so I get that, and I'm going to do something to kind of acknowledge that and bring you together in a way that feels right for you,
Yeah, I think that's important, especially because if we are talking about music being made in the ensemble context, just the statistical likelihood that the moral palette, so to speak, of every single person in the ensemble in that room making music is probably not going to be the same.
Exactly.
And so I've talked a little bit on the show too about the Enneagram. It's a similar way of looking at it, in that like not everybody's motivations for what they do is the same. And in this context of the righteous mind, it's talking about moral taste buds and moral matrices and stuff like that. Not everybody's, like, I guess, disgust reaction would be triggered in the same way. Like I was thinking, I'm glad you brought up that study, the India versus U.S. study, because one of the things that he was, did I get you back? You're back?
Oh yeah, I'm back. Okay. Say that one more time.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the Orissa study, because it was a really good way of highlighting the idea of moral relativism, but in the sense that even with two different cultures might have a different opinion about what is right or wrong in a certain scenario, oftentimes they have the same underlying reasons that something might be right or wrong, but they apply them differently in different situations, which I find it fascinating. And so if I'm in a room in front of a bunch of people, I just see it as, quite frankly, arrogance to the highest degree to assume that my interpretation of all those things is the one that's right.
Right. Well, and the question is also, how do you, because I mean, I sometimes experience this thing now because, like, back when I started composing, it was mostly white men who were composing, and that's fine. I mean, I love white men. They're great. They compose great music. And it was always this thing where, people well, I guess you're a composer. I guess we have to kind of engage you in whatever way. And I definitely felt like a weirdness. But what I feel now is almost a little bit worse, in the sense that people are afraid to ask me questions because they're afraid that they're going to offend me. And I'm like, oh my God, please ask me questions. I'm so excited to tell you all these things that I want you to know, about Indian classical music. But I can see in their mind, they're like, oh, we can't ask her where she's from. We can't ask her anything about this music. If we show her up, she'll get mad and cancel us, all these things. And I think, like, the question is, how do we, you're right, not assume just our right interpretation, and how do we open things up for people to actually tell us what their interpretation of something is,
Mm-hmm.
and how do we, not come from a place of apology, but from a place of curiosity. And that's what I think that this book kind of gives us the tools to do, to say, okay, you're maybe looking at someone in your choir, or I'm looking at someone in a group I work with, and I think, like, okay, this is not hitting them in the right way. Maybe I can run through all of these Jonathan Haidt moral matrices. Like, is there some kind of sanctity issue? Is there some kind of thing where maybe something I'm saying doesn't hit them right because they're from a different religious group? And can I, instead of, apologizing immediately, can I actually engage them and say, hey, what is it about this that feels weird to you? Just tell me, And so at least I have that knowledge. And I think that's the only way that we can develop a fluency in other people's moral matrices.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the best way to think of it, is what you just said at the end. Being fluent in each other's moral matrices. It's not that I have to take yours on. It's that I, like, in other words, I don't have to make yours mine, but if I can talk about yours from the perspective of being literate in them, then that's important. So, kind of going back to and this is perfect because you have family from India and in India, I'm assuming still.
Yes. Yeah.
And so, that since that example was brought up in the book, let's just stay there for a second. He was talking a lot about how the two cultures might define a specific instance as being either fair or unfair, and there might be a disagreement on whether or not the participants in the study describe it as fair or unfair. But of course, the commonality is that they both care about what is fair. It's just that they have different ways of defining what fair is based on culture and also based on moral matrices. So, are there real world examples for you in your life of where there's been that tension between maybe some cultural aspects of your Indian heritage versus life here in America, or versus your own moral palette?
Oh, 100%. And I think the thing happened for me is basically, I when I went to India and I was living there for a year, and also bear in mind, I'm living there for a year, not as a white person, but as an Indian person who people think is from India. So they're treating me like I have their same
Uh-huh.
moral matrix. And then when I come back to America, I mean, everyone can clearly tell by my accent, I'm from America, and they're treating me like I have their moral matrix. And so you kind of
Hmm.
get to test out these different things of, if I was this person, what would I feel? And I mean, there are very simple things, for instance, like, Indians don't show their shoulders. Like, it's weird. Like, it's to have to wear a tank top or something, unless you're in the center of Mumbai or something. If you're in a village, it would feel weird. And I will say that still to this day, I wore tops all the time, and now I just feel a little bit weird because I'm so used to that odd feeling of when you look like you're naked in India because you're wearing a tank top. So things that are just that visceral and basic. But then on the other hand, I mean, one of the things that I think is really different, specifically in musicians' moral matrices between these two areas, is just the reading of music, right? So in the West, we think of, oh, you're reading music, therefore you're so learned. You can just read a thing off the page. You can realize figured bass. You can, transpose things at sight, and it all has to do with the fact that, like, you're knowledgeable because you are, like, able to read something very quickly. In Indian music, it's like, if you show up on the stage with a piece of paper in your hand, it would be like an actor doing a play holding the script, right?
Yeah.
And people
Yep.
are looking at them like, wait, did they not memorize their lines? Like, are they, are they just an amateur? And so I can see both things. And I can see when, I write pieces that have both these people in the same piece, that they are looking at one another. Like, the concertmaster is looking at the sitar player and being like, okay, so this person just has a little bit of, scrawled things there, or this person isn't able really to read music, like what's going on here? And the sitar player is looking at the orchestra and the concertmaster and thinking like, wait a minute, like this person has his nose buried in the score and is not looking at me. Like, did they not rehearse before? And it's just seeing that look of disbelief on each group's faces is like, oh, I have so much to explain to you about, you both have these values of wanting to be good musicians, but you just realize them very different ways.
Right. Choralosophy content is always free, but Patreon subscribers voluntarily chip in a little bit to financially support this show every single month. The producers at patreon.com/Choralosophy are Brannigan Lawrence, Chandler Smith, Vasquez Academy of Music, John Warner, Ulrika Igrain Munoz Alarcon, Angie Schilling, David Kowalczyk, James Mock, Jared Hendricks, Kyle Peterson, Michael Herron, Jeff Wall, Nathan Hines, Ryan Main, and Stephen Kathy Kakachik. I've discovered that Distinguished Concerts International in New York, DCINY, is far and above the rest, especially for those of us from parts of the country that don't turn out for the arts in the way that New York does. Your students, your singers deserve that. I've had personal experiences with a few different companies that have done this type of tour, and I can tell you that it matters who you choose. It matters who you entrust your students' dollars, their time, their energy, and their hopes for a trip like this, because it's a big deal, and for the students, oftentimes it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Check out the offerings that they have there at dciny.org. Now, what's interesting about the two examples you brought up is this is not intended to refute your examples, only to make them deeper. Both of the examples you just described also exist within the United States cultures as well. So, so for example, you talked about wearing a tank top in India. My wife is from the Mormon belt of southern Idaho, where it is the same thing. In fact, when she moved to Kansas City, where people dress however they feel like, she moved here, and she was not Mormon growing up, but just because she was around that set of moral values, she got to Kansas City, and she used to say really weird things when we were first dating about the outfits she was wearing. And I was very confused by it because she'd be getting ready, and she'd say something like, I'd be like, oh, wear those shorts. And I can't wear shorts. I'm wearing a tank top. And and I was like, what are you talking about? And then later I figured out, she explained it, because, well, in the Mormon areas, like, you can show some skin, but you can't show skin on top and on bottom. Like, that's just too much. So if I'm wearing like a tank top, I need to wear long pants, and if I'm wearing shorts, then I need to wear like something over my shoulders. Like, it's just too much. And I was like, what are you talking about?
Right.
I'd never heard about that. Now, musically, this is interesting because you brought up the difference in Indian music versus reading. What to me, what I kept thinking about when you were telling that story is that also exists within American musical cultures, depending on the type of music. Right? So, like, if I were to get up in front of an audience and sing, I don't know, like a gospel song in church, it would be a way more authentic for me to have memorized that piece and just pick up a microphone and start singing from my heart.
Right.
Whereas I think the reading the music off the page in performance thing it's a Western classical thing.
Exactly.
It's not even.
Pop musicians don't do that. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Like musical theater, you're not going to get up on stage and perform from the sheet music. So and in fact, I just had to write a contract out for a gig that I'm getting ready to do next year. That's in the classical world, the classical vocal world. And I had to explain to the person paying the bill that because they want it memorized, it's going to cost more.
Yeah, exactly. It takes more time.
Yeah, because the choral, like, especially in the pro choral world, like, we are used to showing up and reading it. And so if you want us to show up having memorized it ahead of time, well, that's like way more, right? And they were like, some people are, if you're not in that world, you're confused by that.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's just this visceral feeling too of like, okay, how do you feel when you feel like someone is asking you to do a thing that's different? Because in a way, one of the things I was thinking about as I was reading this book is like, what are like quote unquote guilty pleasures, right? Guilty pleasures are things that we love and that we feel bad for loving, right? It's like, look, truth be told, when I'm working out and I need a pickup song, I totally listen to Katy Perry Firework, right? I don't know why, it just does it for me. so happy. And it's like, that's a thing where there's something to that music that must have some kind of merit that, obviously it's not like I could say that to a group of, doctoral students in a composition program to has so much merit. Why not though? Because I think that's where we just assign these kind of values to certain things. And obviously there's probably so many people who are assigning major value to Katy Perry firework because clearly it's, doing something in the market, it's engaging people. Why do we pick a lane instead of being like, look, if you're looking at things through this moral matrix, this is an excellent piece. If you're looking at it through this moral matrix, this is an excellent piece. And I think, even when I'm teaching composition students, I'll always ask them first, like, what are you actually trying to achieve here? Like, what are you going for? Because I need to understand what you want to have happen before I can even understand whether that thing is happening in your piece or not.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like when we look at people's worldviews, I mean, I always try to play out when I think I feel differently than someone about something. I think, okay, if everything they wanted came true, what would they actually want to have happen? And if that's what's happening, then okay, they've achieved success, even though it's not my version of success. It's just important to be able to embody that for a moment.
Right. Yeah. Now I totally agree. It kind of goes back to what I said earlier, where I don't have to necessarily take on your entire palette, but if I can at least talk about it with you as if I'm validating it, and as if I'm recognizing that your palette is a fully valid and reasonable one to have, then even if we could do that, then I think a lot of the disagreements that we get stuck in, or even the awkward cultural back and forth that make us feel so uncomfortable, could be they could be so much more open and conversational, I feel like.
I mean, and I think, one of the things that struck me as an example of this is, not everyone who has a job is a Christian, right? It's like, I know people who are Jewish, who are Muslim, who are all kinds of different faiths, who are atheists, who have church jobs. And it's like, okay, I mean, these people are deeply embodying value, and they're not doing it with cynicism at all, right? They love the music. They're happy to be there. They're happy to be with a group of people who, cares deeply about something. And they're kind of embodying a different moral matrix than the one that they maybe grew up with, or they even believe culturally. And that's a really great example of, the way that music can kind of connect us, even and it can allow us to kind of embody one another's moral matrices really deeply, because they're saying words that are different than the words that they might believe. But, does that allow them to maybe get into the head of someone who does believe those things?
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned it earlier too, and I want to kind of go back to this, which is the idea that you talked about how in your beginning of your composition career, it was all the white dudes, and then now it's like really, really hip to be not a white dude, and so now it's very, it's all the rage, and so
Great, yeah.
right, but now it's almost that there is this new problem, which is that you are treated as a not white dude, as if you are a delicate flower that has to be handled like in this kind of awkward way. And to me, it kind of goes back to this moral and ethical fluency thing, where we're making it hard, these conversations difficult, that don't necessarily have to be difficult if we just are open with each other and are willing to say, heaven forbid, where are you from? Let's have that conversation. You are not going to fall over.
Right. And the thing that actually gives me a lot of hope is that I feel like in the very youngest generation, people are starting to kind of see through that as like, it's not always a matter of like microaggression, or it's not always a matter of like people trying to insult you by asking you a question. But I feel for young people, and especially people who are maybe in their 20s now, who have come into the professional world in a time when all of this is changing so fast. And if you are any identity other than white and male, you're being asked to have your whole life be about that identity, right? So people who are like maybe trying to figure out their sexuality, and I mean, what a deeply personal thing, right? That is just a thing that you need to kind of do yourself and talk to your friends about, but all of a sudden, oh my gosh, you're getting commissions because of your sexuality. How tough must that be as a young person? So I can see that in a way are freaking out because they need to have a boundary and don't quite know how to have it. The minute that kind of capitalism, the minute that donors, the minute that foundations come in and say, hey, we're interested in you because of this very deeply personal thing about you, it's hard to not feel like you have to address that before you're ready. So that I totally understand. But at the same time, I think people also don't realize that there's a difference between people who are just very young and figuring that out for the first time, and people who have been in this field for years. And I was thinking the other day, and maybe I said this last time too, that, Tanya Leon, who is an incredible composer, and I mean, she's had a decades-long career. And there was a point where she was like, Reena, I've been called all these, like, there's every possible acronym, like I've been called. This is what I was called in the 70s. This is what I was called in the 80s. And I was like, oh, Tanya, that's so funny. She's just been through so much of this transition that she's fine with whatever it is people are doing at that moment. And she's just there for the music and there to kind of engage people in the things that she loves. And so, for me, a lot of the mentorship that I do for people who are women or people of color and are battling this stuff for the first time is to kind of say, like, hey, your issues that you want to deal with personally are really important, and you don't need to, parade everything out for the public to see. But also realize that, people are just trying to engage you and are trying to, they might like your music and just want to know more about you, and just see that for what it is.
Yeah. Yeah, I think because what we're in a cultural moment where acquiring social capital is as important as acquiring any other type of capital. If we want to talk about capitalism, social capital is part of that too.
Yes.
In that, I have to acquire as much social capital as possible. And now, in the moment we are in, living, I guess you could kind of, like you were talking about, living all of your drama out loud in front of everyone is actually a really good way to earn social capital, because we love the victim and the underdog right now.
Exactly.
Like,
yes.
And so people are incentivized, actually, which is, I think this is where it gets into the trouble, is that we are incentivized to make as big of a deal out of our drama as possible.
Yeah.
And then that becomes a little bit of an issue, because, like, we're talking about the identity of composers and sexuality and different types of things, because then we're talking about hiring composers or conductors or whatever based on a list of attributes that they did not choose about themselves.
Right. Yeah.
And that's tricky.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like, yeah, I mean, to what extent are you then, on the other side, does imposter syndrome come in, where you think, oh, did people just hire me for this reason that has nothing to do with how much they like my music, or how much how talented they think I am? And then that creates a whole other weird feedback loop for sure. Yeah. And I mean, the other thing, to be so honest with you, as this, Supreme Court decision with Roe versus Wade came down, the first thing I thought was like, oh my goodness, women are going to have to tell these stories in order to get funded. And I'm like, oh my God, to have to tell those deeply personal stories about, your own pregnancy or lack thereof. I mean, we shouldn't be monetizing that. We shouldn't be, capitalizing on that. But I mean, how long is it going to be? Because already we're capitalizing on race, on gender, on sexuality, on all these other metrics. And, also to be even more honest, the thing that I've kind of put together that is so dark, it's really, really dark, is that in a way, people who used to fund the arts, and this is a really known thing, is that people who used to be very interested in just funding art for art's sake have now realized, oh my gosh, the world is this insane place. We actually want to move our funding away from arts and into social justice. So arts have been, major organizations have been losing funding to social justice organizations, which I totally understand, because, this is a really tough time in our world. And unfortunately, the arts organizations, it puts them in a bind where then they have to say, wait a minute, if you want to fund social justice, we can do social justice too. Like, we can find oppressed people, we can do. And so then they come to us as artists. And I mean, I will tell you some of the grants that I got myself. they're just things that I never should have read. But when you see them, I'm not really oppressed. Maybe I'm a different race and gender, but I think that's kind of fun and interesting. And, I have so many exciting worlds that I want to connect, but just being called underrepresented and, these stories that people tell about you are very selective. It's like telling the story about how I grew up in Hollywood and I went to school with celebrities' kids. That was part upbringing too, right? But It's like people then just mine these, they want you to tell your story of oppression, and that's not always any or most of your story. But when there's money behind it, and especially when there's money that people are trying to keep in their organizations from going to social justice organizations, you can see how difficult that could be.
Yeah, and what's interesting about this is, I'm glad you brought this up, because you can, and I think this is where it gets really tricky within the arts and within the music circles, and ties us all the way back to the purpose of this book that we were talking about, which is that if you understand where you and I are coming from as we critique these things that are going on, what we are not saying is that it's, well, let's see if I can put it this way. You can critique music organizations and arts organizations going full bore into social justice activism at the expense possibly of the art making, while not saying that social justice is not a worthy goal.
Exactly.
In other words, you can hold both thoughts.
Yeah.
And that's where I've been for quite a while, which is that I am very concerned with the direction of what degree are we focused on activism, and to what degree are we focused on art making, and are we appropriately balancing those two things? Because they really aren't the same thing. In other words, you could say, well, an organization could do both. Well, yes, they could, but there's only so many hours in the day, and there's only so many minutes in a meeting. There's only so many letter or words on a grant application. So you do have to think about, like, what proportion of my time and energy am I dedicating to X, Y, Z, and then you have to figure out if that aligns with your goals. And so what I'm suggesting, and this goes right into the book, I think, is that there could be multiple right answers to that.
Yeah, and to even bring a different part of the book into it, and this was a study that I was so excited to actually find someone had done a study on, is that people will do what they think others think makes them look good, instead of doing what actually is what they think the right thing to do is.
Yes.
And I feel like there's a better way to say that than I'm saying it. But and again, for those of you who haven't read the book, if you just go and read the study, it's absolutely incredible, where there are different philosophies. One is like, oh, people will always do, they'll always want to do the right thing. But no, it's actually proven in many cases that people are just interested in being as selfish as they need to be or whatever, but doing the thing that looks the best, And so again, it's like seeing that through the lens of what's happening, these days. There are certain organizations that are absolutely amazing and are making art at the highest levels and are finding ways to, open the dialogue with people from different cultures and stuff. And that, I think, is incredible, right? Because I think diversity, and I've always said this, the main diversity is diversity of perspective, right? And if you think about this, recently I've been, I'm following some people who run like investing blogs and stuff. And we think of this idea of portfolio diversification, right? That's also diversity. Why are we talking about diversity in terms of investing? It's because you want to basically mitigate your risk as much as possible by investing in things from I guess people or organizations or stocks or whatever who are taking different tacks and different perspectives. And so I think that's what can ultimately strengthen our organizations, right? This idea that diversity is what makes us stronger. But what I think people are really missing here is that diversity is very difficult. And when you bring people in who have viewpoints that are more and more and more different from one another, do we really have the capacity to deal with that? And then what ends up happening is, if we don't, we end up hiring people who don't have different viewpoints, but just look kind of different from one another, and we get this kind of optic diversity. And so I think, if we're going to really talk about diversity, we need to talk about kind of what, Jonathan Haidt ends the book with, to say that communities are built based on shared values. So look, maybe you're from all these different places, but maybe you agree that this kind of music should be in the world. Like maybe you agree that choral music should exist and should be wonderful and be super high level and everyone loves it, or whatever it is, right? Start with that shared value, and from there figure out how everyone is contributing their perspective to making that value correct. But I feel like we just are not there at all.
Yeah. Well, because I think what we're doing is the organizations now are being run by their DEI wings. Okay.
Yeah.
So what they're doing is they're saying our shared value is we will do diversity, equity, and inclusion in this prescribed way. And here is our list of goals and values, and here's what we will do. And this is now our defining value as an organization. And then, of course, nowhere in that is anything about music or art or whatever. And so then you have this conflict where if a bunch of people came to the organization for arts, and now the defining values of the organization are not arts-based anymore, and so then we have these arguments within arts organizations about, again, what proportion of our time and energy should be devoted to that. And I think that's a valid question, and you need fluency in these various moral matrices in order to have that conversation productively, which is really important. And I also like what you said. A second, I'll kick it back to you here about diversity too, because I brought this up in an episode recently. Just this idea that you can't measure diversity in a photograph.
Exactly.
But I think that a lot of our DEI work in organizations has become photograph-based diversity. In other words, we are judging it based on immutable characteristics that you can measure on paper. Now, if you think about it, that's not sinister. It has to do with how easy it is to show success on paper, to submit that success to a granting organization to show that you've made progress. But you can't show all that progress by opinions and viewpoints and diversity of outlooks and diversity of moral matrices. You can't show that on paper. It's too complicated.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting because we talk about this kind of representation piece, which is the kind of counter argument to that of, if we show all these people doing these things, then other people will feel that they can do stuff. I mean, number one, the issue with that is that it's like, look, as an Indian woman, there was no part of me that ever thought like, oh, I am incapable of composing until I see another Indian woman composing. The thing that I thought was just like, oh, there might be people who, like they don't really they're not like interesting to me. So they're doing these things and, I could do something else, So it's also this idea that maybe even if I were to compose, I wouldn't necessarily see myself in that position because maybe the world just wouldn't acknowledge my talent the way it has the people that are in the picture. So, I mean, that's the other side of the argument, but it's interesting that you bring this up because I had this deeply, I don't know, it really kind of shook me, this thing that happened recently where I was working with the amazing conductor, Marin Alsop. And, she's like legendary woman conductor. And up until that point, I have had like zero interest in conducting. Like there is not a bone in my body that has ever wanted to conduct. And there was just something about working with Marin that made me think like, oh my gosh, I totally understand what this is. I can just understand her vision. I totally love her. I feel like and this is just deeply inspiring to me in a way that no conductor before her has ever inspired me. And I was like, I feel like maybe I'm like so unimaginative and so uncreative that I need to see a woman doing this thing in order for me to feel like I can do that. And I was like, you're a creative person. This is a terrible, like, what's wrong with you? You have no imagination. But then I realized, look, it's not that she's a woman or not a woman. It's that the specific way that she deals with things and the challenges she's faced and the way it's not even, what's the word? It's not even the metric of who she is, but just how she kind of navigates through the world felt similar to me, to the way that I navigate through the world. But
Yep.
it's like, you can't show that on a grant application, right? And so it becomes this thing about these optics, where really the thing that is giving people the most is the fact that she is a world-class conductor that's had some interesting challenges that, kind of parallel challenges that other women have had.
Yeah. Right. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I think of all of the concepts related to these kind of social justice, identity-based social justice is probably the better way to explain it. Representation is the one that makes the most sense to me, actually, because I've seen it in my own students, my relatively diverse student population. I've been at my school long enough to remember when the choir program was all white. And I was there when the first few kids of color kind of snuck in and started being brave and trying out for like the upper level choirs, and then opening a floodgate of other kids that quote unquote look like them. I hate that expression, but
Totally.
that opened the floodgates for them. So I do believe that is true, in the sense that it's not that they're not imaginative enough to think that they could do it. I think it's that it also is a way to send a signal that they're welcome, in
Exactly.
a world that doesn't teach them they're welcome.
And that their talents will be valued.
Yes.
And I mean, I'll take that even one step further, in that, I obviously do work where I have Indian classical music or Indian classical concepts. And, I'm an Indian woman who's working, in this space. And I can't tell you, one of my pieces, actually the reason we met was this piece, Tarakita, that was published by Oxford University Press.
Hmm.
And since then, it's done in the tens of thousands of sales. It's gone so far beyond what I could have ever imagined. So thank you for your role in that. But what's really interesting is that now there are Indian kids who are in choir, like, I mean, I say Desi, like people who are South Asian kids, and they're so excited to like share their culture with their peers. And, and I just sometimes will go on and go to YouTube and look at all these recordings, and some of them, like, they have Indian dance along with them. There are people doing like hand positions. There's all these amazing things that happen because they feel that their culture is being valued. So for me, yeah, I love my identity when it can make other people feel like, hey, I kind of can see, I have a similar experience. I feel like there's something really resonant about that. But that's not necessarily a thing that can be engineered, and it's a thing that has to come from, the person themselves, I think.
Right. Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. I had an interesting conversation with my 14-year-old daughter the other day. She's just now getting to the age where she's starting to become aware of a lot of the cultural conversations like we're having. She's not like up to speed on, just exactly how woke she's going to be or whatever, but she kind of is hearing some of these things. And the other day she asked me, Dad, what culture even are we? Like, do we have a culture? And I said, well, yeah, we do. We're Midwestern American. And of
Mhm.
course, she had never heard that before, because
Right.
what she hears is we're white. And I'm like,
Right.
yeah. So it gave me a chance to explain to her, yes, we are, but we are a very peculiar type of white that has a very peculiar type of culture that exists in the Midwestern United States. And if you and I were to go to like Alabama, deep South, around a bunch of other people who have white skin too, their culture would be very different than ours.
Exactly.
They would eat different food. They would have different expressions. They would listen to different music. All those types of things. And I think we've gotten to the point where to our detriment in the U.S. in particular, we have started boiling culture down to melanin.
Exactly.
When in reality, my culture could not be more different than somebody in Ukraine, for example. We have white skin, but
Exactly.
our
Exactly.
culture is not the same.
Yeah, and I mean, for that matter, like, look, I'm a valley girl from the valley of the valley girls, right? And so I can slip into that accent. I went to school in the valley. I was like, again, grew up kind of Hollywood tangentially, even though my parents were not in Hollywood or in film at all. But it's like, that's a really deep part of my culture too. I have this, who I am is as much informed by that. But I feel like there are just, again, the melanin in your skin, the way that you look is valued more than other things. And I think, if we really want to achieve that kind of really broad level diversity. It's like your daughter grew up a certain way. You have family traditions. Like she should be just as excited to talk about them as I am to talk about like my grandmother making samosas, right? Those two things are equally valid. And I don't think we should be minimizing one or the other. And I think, we've definitely maybe gone from this place where we only value a certain culture. Maybe we say that, whatever white American culture, however reductive that is more important than immigrant culture. But I don't think the other way is great either. I think it's like, and even as someone who is from an immigrant culture, I'm so interested in other people's cultural traditions. I'm so interested, in learning about everyone's childhood and everyone's upbringing. You can't just assume that you know something about someone by looking at them.
Yeah, absolutely. I did um, my family, part of our cultural, I guess, upbringing, being in the Midwest, and maybe this is true in other parts of the U.S., but I feel like it's very true in the Midwest, because we're in the middle of the country. We do like road trips is a big deal because we can drive like in a day, like less than a day, we can get to either coast. And so just like the idea of like I grew up doing road trips all the time. And and have you ever like driven across the whole country?
I've wanted to, but I just never have, but that sounds amazing.
Highly recommend it at some point in your life. You've got to do it, whether it's north to south or east to west, it does not matter, because I think it's the only way. I've traveled a lot in my life, and it's the only way, in my opinion, to understand truly how vastly diverse culturally the United States is. Because you will drive through if you were a sociologist measuring culture, you would have to call all these different little areas different countries, because like I was saying to my daughter, the music is different, the language is different, the customs are different, the food preparation is different. Everything that a sociologist would line up as culture exists in plethora just in the United States. And I'm sure India is that way. I've heard that India has like tons of different like sub languages and cultures and religions. And these are these huge countries. And in the same way, we boil it down like, oh, well, she's Indian. Okay.
Yeah,
Or have
that
you,
literally means nothing
that
in
could be,
India.
right, exactly. Have you ever heard the expression, there are no Asians in Asia?
Exactly. Yeah. They don't think of themselves as Asian. Definitely
Right.
not. And they
Yeah.
don't even think of themselves as like being from a specific country. It's like, oh, well, what lineage are you from? What was your grandfather's name? Like, what was their business? What was it gets so specific in these very old cultures. So,
Uh-huh.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I think it's really the way we are talking about culture right now, in my opinion, is just way more interesting. Yeah,
Oh my
than
God. And I was going to say, just being able to approach everything with curiosity instead of defensiveness. I mean, I think
Mhm.
for me, that is the main thing. Is that if I don't know something, and I've been, for example, another culture that I've been in, I've never been on the kind of board side of an organization until I am the co-chair of the board of New Music USA, and I've just never been on an executive board before, right? I'm a composer with 4 degrees in composing. What do I know? And so it's really been funny because in the pandemic, we have these board meetings and people are throwing around these financial terms I've never heard of. And I'm just there Googling things like, what is this person saying? But, whenever I don't know, I'm never afraid to be like, hey guys, composer here. Just what is this? What are we talking about? And it's always fascinating because people are so excited to explain to you a thing that they love or that they're passionate about. And I think it's just an easier and more colorful way to go through the world, to be curious about everyone and everything.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so I want to do one more thing before we run out of time. And I feel
Yes.
like if we wrap this conversation up, as people should go read The Righteous Mind, it'll spur you to be thinking about a lot of the things that we were just talking about. But let's leave people with something concrete. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to pull up an image of these moral taste buds, so to speak, the 6 key moral foundations. And that way, because we've been talking about them like the whole episode, but for people who have not read the book, I just want to read through them once and kind of point them out. And then what I want to do is have you kind of react and talk about some of the ones and what they mean to you. Okay, so 6 key moral foundations. Throughout the book, The Righteous Mind, Dr. Haidt references how some of these interact with different cultures and also different political affiliations. There's a whole chapter in there about conservatives versus liberals and how they use these different. Everybody's got all 6 of these. but they favor them differently. They use them in different ways. So the 6 key moral foundations are care and harm, fairness and cheating, loyalty versus betrayal, authority versus subversion, sanctity versus degradation, and liberty versus oppression. And then there's, on this chart here, there's listed the adaptive challenges, the original triggers, the key emotions, and the relevant virtues. For sake of time, I'm just going to read the key emotions. So the key emotion for care versus harm is compassion. When we feel compassion towards someone, whether they're in our group or not in our group. Fairness versus cheating, the key emotions are anger, gratitude, or guilt. For loyalty and betrayal, the key emotions are group pride, rage against traitors. The key emotions for authority and subversion are respect and fear. Sanctity versus degradation, the key emotion is disgust. And liberty versus oppression, the key emotion is anger at oppression. So I'm going to bring up one example, and then I want you to fire out some things that you think about, whatever this makes you think about. So that you mentioned earlier in the episode, the Roe v. Wade decision, right? So that's, to me, is a great example of some the people who are worried about liberty versus oppression, which is everyone, by the way.
Right.
We just
Exactly.
we think about it in different ways. So the people who are excited about the Roe v. Wade decision are really excited because in their mind, the people, the young baby people that in their mind they are protecting are now free from oppression. But on the other side, the people who very much are angry about the decision are worried that the women who are now no longer able to make these unilateral decisions are now oppressed. But what you see through reading the book like this is you see that they both care about liberty versus oppression, but their way of formulating a path to a conclusion is opposite, completely opposite. That example jumps right out at me. What are some things you think about from this chart?
Oh, for for any of them, or for liberty?
Yeah, any of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think interestingly, like loyalty and betrayal, it's just that's a kind of an interesting one where, for example, you see someone saying like, oh, this man abused me, and people will come forward, and all these women will come forward, and his wife and kids will be like, oh my god, he's such a great person, like what, and the thing is that they are totally right. I'm sure this man is great to them. Like, just because he has abused other people doesn't necessarily mean that he's not a great husband or a great father, and vice versa. Just because he's a great husband or a great father doesn't necessarily mean that he hasn't abused these people. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that always makes me think is like, the way we are is not like, oh, I'm just a good person or I'm a bad person. It's always in relation to someone else, right? I'm sure there are people who think I'm terrible, right? Because maybe I just haven't treated them well. I mean, I'm certainly not above it. None of us are above it. And then there are other people who probably think I'm just so wonderful because I've treated them really nicely. So I think it kind of goes back to this loyalty betrayal thing of like, we create these, how can I say it? Just these communities based on who we're loyal to, why, what vision of the world that we have, and who we think is important to that vision or not. And none of us are above that.
Yeah, that's a really good example because in that example that you just gave, the loyalty to that man. So, like, say the women in that man's life are saying, "Oh no, he's wonderful, he's gentle, he's kind." And because what they're essentially doing is they're showing loyalty to him because he's part of their family structure, their group, and to acknowledge that he might be the monster that someone else says he is would also reflect badly on them. It's exactly. Like, then who are you to, or what kind of monster are you to have sheltered and bedded this man for so long, right? And so we worry about what other people think of us. And where we sit in these groups, and that triggers some of these emotional responses. It's really interesting.
Well, and I mean, also to just hold these multiple truths in our mind. Like, for example, like, people who treat people terribly but make amazing art. I think one of the hardest things in my mind as an adult has been justifying that. It's like, okay, do we stop playing Wagner because he did all these terrible things, or do we keep on doing it, and do we forget it? And I think we should be using more of our kind of cognition to hold these difficult things in our mind. Like, yes, Wagner was a person who did terrible things and had terrible views that were really oppressive to some people, and also also wrote amazing music. And I don't think that I don't think we're really seeing humans for the complex people that they truly are if we're not seeing that that situation is true of a lot of people. It's not just these public figures. Like we all have these dark sides, and light sides based on who we're showing them to. And so I just think, being able to acknowledge those things is really important to being able to understand one another, being able to get along with one another, and being able to give each other a little bit of compassion and forgiveness, to talk about compassion.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love that example too. So let's talk about the Wagner thing for a second, because I think that's on our chart here.
Yeah.
That is under the sanctity and degradation part.
Right.
Because what that is people saying, no, we cannot play Wagner anymore because we know what he really believed about Jews. Okay, well, that is the expression of somebody who is expressing that Wagner is no longer chaste or pure. Wagner is no longer clean because we know that he has this flaw. Right? Now, what's interesting about that, and I might, if anyone's listening this far into the episode, I will probably get some pushback for this, but that is actually a conservative view, but is typically nowadays voiced by people on the left, which is really interesting, because that when I was a kid, the sanctity degradation meter was really high amongst Christian evangelicals. It still is, but now we see it with things like that too, where we can't. You can't associate with this person because he has this view or that view or whatever, so you can no longer perform his music. You can no longer. That is a very conservative sanctity versus degradation kind of a mindset.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's like, I mean, I know like that example and so many other examples of people, who are similar to that has gotten so many of us thinking about like, how do we deal with this and how do we handle this? And my one thought, the one salient thought I've had is like, okay, if someone has like moral values that you really disagree with or have been, in your mind is desanctified, how do you deal with that? And my thought is, maybe really get to know their music well so that maybe you can just be better than them. You have their knowledge, right? You have their, like, maybe I should go in and really try to understand how Wagner works and get the absolute best out of his music and then take it forward in a way that isn't anti-Semitic,
Yeah.
And I think like, if we're not learning from the good things of bad people, then we're not able to move the dial a little bit further forward, And I mean, again, bad people in whose eyes, I mean, maybe a lot of people clearly believe that Wagner was their savior. So,
Right. Well, and you're also not able, when you can't do that, when you can't allow your mind to be that flexible, you're also not pulling all of the goodness out of the complexity of humanity. When you do that, you're boiling it down. You're being reductive. So, to me, the ultimate middle finger to Wagner as a bigoted anti-Semite would be to be able to play his music and have a rapturously joyous experience, and then leave the concert hall and love on a Jew.
Exactly.
Because then you're saying, okay, Wagner, as you flip him off, you're saying, I took everything that you gave us that was beautiful and wonderful, and I left on the floor all of your trash views.
Exactly.
That to me is like, that's how you beat Wagner.
I know. And I think it's just being able to hold that complexity that's so important. And the other thing is also that not everyone can hold both sides, because obviously, say there's like a Jewish person whose grandparents have been in the Holocaust. I mean, okay, maybe it's going to be harder for them to hold that view, but I think for those of us who that view is a little bit more distant, like I don't have any direct relation to the Holocaust or something, maybe the onus is on me to actually get the best out of something that I can, so that I can eventually pass it along or be a beacon of it without those views that would trigger someone else,
Yeah.
And there's certain things, like for me, there's certain news stories I just cannot watch. There's certain things I just can't engage with. A lot of what's going on in India right now is so difficult for me because it affects me personally. But I mean, I really want other people to kind of get in there and engage with that difficulty, because I kind of can't.
Right. And that's valid too. Not every battle needs to be everyone's battle.
Exactly.
And that's okay too. But I think ultimately what I'm getting at with the Wagner thing is just the idea that we get to rise above the ideas of the past, which is what progress is. But if what we're doing is shedding and destroying and jettisoning everything from the past, then we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, basically.
Yeah, we're destined to make the exact same mistakes that we would make otherwise. And I think we are kind of making some of those same mistakes. My dog is very excited about whatever he's excited about. Yeah, I mean, one last thing that I want to say, one kind of galvanizing thing that I really felt after reading The Righteous Mind was, this idea that you have to find ways to build trust in people who are different from you in order to be able to say those difficult things and have those difficult conversations. And he kind of ends the book with this way of saying that, if you want to change someone's mind, you start by kind of appealing to their emotions. And I would even take it a step further. I mean, I don't know that I can't be persuaded. Like, maybe someone should change my mind. I could be totally wrong about something, and I'm happy to hear that other perspective, in the idea that I could be as easily persuaded as I could persuade them. But the idea is that, you come from this place of mutual trust. And I will say that music, and especially choral music at its best, builds that mutual trust, right? You have a shared goal of creating something really beautiful together. You're standing beside people, saying the same words and deeply engaging in them. And I think that to me, choral music is one of those places where we can develop shared trust across all kinds of contexts. And so, I mean, that was something that really felt positive to me about the book.
I agree. I couldn't have said it better myself. This has been really fun. I know you've got to run to another thing, so we got to wrap this up, don't we?
I do. Yes.
Yeah.
But oh my goodness, this has been wonderful.
So much fun. And I really appreciate you reviewing the concepts with us. And this is going to be, I think, a really fun episode for people to pour through. And I will attach your previous episode in the show notes, and as well as links to all your stuff. And everybody needs to go check out Reena's music.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this. And Jonathan Haidt, if you're listening, we love you and we love your book. So thank you for the great work you do in the world.
I'll tag him for sure.
Please do.
All right.
All right.
Have a great night.
You too. Bye.
All right. Bye. Thank you, as always, for listening to that episode. I just love talking to Reena, and she is such brilliant insights and perspective. To bring it back to full circle from the introduction to the show, her perspective is unique. She can bring all kinds of interesting insights. As you heard her say, mixes a lot of cultural backgrounds all into one, because it's complicated. How many cultural hats can we wear? And the answer is it's almost infinite. If we learn how to respect and how to ask questions of each other and really live near each other and around each other and work together and sing together and play together, culture is just something that oozes out from that activity. You can't stop it. And I think it's a beautiful thing. It's one of the best things about being a musician and about being a human, to be honest. So thanks for listening. And of course, if you've got the ability and the time, it's always helpful for you to share and like and leave comments and bring people to the show. And of course, leave ratings, go to Patreon and subscribe. There's all kinds of ways that you can help out. But thank you. Ultimately, the main way you help out is by listening. So thanks, everybody, and we'll see you next time.